Dr. Craig Evans is one of the foremost scholars alive today in the study of the historical Jesus, and he focuses especially on Jesus' death and resurrection. He's lectured at Cambridge, Oxford, Princeton, and Yale. He's been interviewed by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he served as a consultant for the Bible television miniseries viewed by over 100 million North Americans. Dr. Craig Evans has published over 70 books, hundreds of scholarly journal articles and reviews, and he is the Dean of Christian Thought at Houston Baptist University. Dr. Evans, welcome back today on this Good Friday.
Thank you.
We're going to talk a little bit about how our head and our heart and the historical evidence match up behind the events of Jesus' death and resurrection. So your latest book is all about archaeology and the historical Jesus. And there actually is some archaeological evidence surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus. How important is our understanding of archaeology to our faith?
I think it's very important because what it does is it shows the Gospels are telling the truth. Some late fiction would get it wrong, and I know that because we do have late fictions written in the 2nd century, 3rd century, and they get things wrong.
Like, for example, what would a late fiction be?
Well, there's a work called the Gospel of Peter. We think it was written in the middle of the 2nd century, and it has some outlandish features in it that just do not reflect the way things really were. And that's what I like about archaeology. You can have theories, you can have ideas, you can have preferences, but when you dig things up, you find out the way things really were.
That's rather interesting because I know it's a surprise to some Christians to discover that there are more than just 4 Gospels. There's the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, and if you've read Dan Brown, who's had some very popular novels, he'll reference the Gospel of Thomas where Jesus gets married. But archaeology seems to suggest what you're saying, that the account told in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is actually more accurate.
That's right. And what we call it, it's a fancy Latin word, verisimilitude, but historians and archaeologists love that word because they want sources that reflect the way things really were, and that's what verisimilitude, similar to the truth, the way things really were. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts talk about real people, real places, real events. They exhibit verisimilitude. And that's why archaeologists, whether they're Jewish, Christian, or whatever, all archaeologists who work in Israel make use of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, not the other Gospels that Dan Brown talked about.
Fascinating. So even non-Christian archaeologists will use the Gospels because they believe they're the most accurate accounts?
Oh, yes, of course. I go to Israel every year. I involve myself in archaeological digs. I visit digs. I talk to the archaeologists. I go to the museum. I mean, Israel, we find things in Israel every single year. Wow. And so that's why I wrote this book, actually, was to just get caught up on the field because we keep finding things. Well, nobody would use a source that didn't tell you anything helpful.
Right.
Well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts shed light on the world of Jesus, and that's why archaeologists know where to dig and how to interpret what they dig up in light of what these New Testament writings tell us.
So what I hear you saying is the more we dig up, the more accurate Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John appear?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there have been skepticism in the past, theories about, I think Matthew is wrong here or Luke doesn't have it right. Then we dig something up and realize, oops, we were wrong. I'm not aware of a single discovery that shows that one of the Gospels got it wrong.
So when Luke starts out his Gospel by saying, now I want to give you the most accurate account because there are many circulating, he was telling the truth.
Oh yeah, he knew what he was talking about, and he talks about eyewitnesses.
Right.
And so if you want to get the story straight, it's always best to go to an eyewitness and not rely on third hand, and that's what Luke has done, and it shows.
So that's comforting, I think, for those of us as we read the gospel accounts of Jesus' death and his resurrection, that we're actually not reading fiction, we're reading an account of what happened to a man who lived 2,000 years ago, who we believe is God. Now, you also say in your new book that archaeology has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that impacts our faith and what we know about Jesus?
Well, archaeology is far more scientific than it used to be, and it's not by the seat of the pants. And I hope our viewers understand we're not talking about Indiana Jones,
right.
sort of a smash and grab, but it's very scientific, and it involves ground-penetrating radar. It involves X-ray. GPS. I mean, we actually
Wow.
measure exactly where we are and exactly the altitude, how deep we go down. Everything is bagged and tagged, labeled. You can't believe how much is uncovered. The dig I've been involved in recent years, it's in Jerusalem at Mount Zion. We unearth tons of debris every week, and then we bag and tag thousands of artifacts.
Wow.
And so it's extremely involved. And so what happens is you get accuracy and good records, and that's very important.
What is archaeology these days? And we touched on this a little bit earlier this week if people were watching, but what are archaeologists unearthing as far as crucifixion goes, and what can that tell us about Jesus on Good Friday?
Well, hundreds of tombs have been excavated, and thousands of skeletons have been excavated over the last century or so. And we have actually found skeletons of people who have been crucified or executed in some other way. Wow. And what's important about that, not only do we learn about how people were executed, which is a pretty grim topic, or even crucified, but for me, the really important thing is if you were executed, even crucified, you were still properly buried. You might have been buried in dishonor and in shame, but you were still properly buried. And that's in keeping with the Jewish custom. After 1 year of being buried in a criminal's grave, then the family could gather your bones, put them in a bone box, and relocate your remains to the family tomb. That is what I'm sure the family and disciples of Jesus were expecting to do. Of course, the resurrection changed everything.
Yeah, that surprised me. I didn't know that. I read that in your book, that basically I think it was Jewish practice in the first century that you would bury someone twice. You would bury them once, and then a year later, and again, this is not for weak stomachs, but you would dig them up and then put their bones in an ossuary. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so Jesus was following, after his death, they were following that practice where they entombed him.
Oh yeah, there's no question of it. That's how the gospel story tells it. The women go to the tomb to anoint his body. Do you know why?
No.
It's so they could be in the tomb and pray and weep quietly. That was allowed for an executed criminal. Not public lamentation, that was not allowed. But go to his tomb, weep quietly, pray in his tomb for 7 days. And that's why corpses were perfumed. Can you imagine?
Oh my goodness.
Day 5, day 6, yeah. So they go, then that's the first opportunity. The Sabbath is over. They go Sunday morning, and to their horror, they find the stone rolled aside, and the tomb is empty.
Because they're not thinking resurrection.
No, I think what they're fearing is Jesus had been placed in a brand new tomb out of the compassion of Joseph of Arimathea. They probably assumed that when Caiaphas, the high priest, hears that, he says, no way, take his body out of there and put it in the criminal tomb where it belongs.
Right.
And they see that, and of course, the problem is you have to identify a corpse. That was the Jewish practice. Okay. The corpse is laid out in a niche, and then they write his name in charcoal above it. So 1 year later, you know that, because you can't
tell anymore.
So you gather the bones, place them in a box, then you scratch with a nail or something the person's name on the box. Yeah. Now you know. So can you imagine, to their consternation, they go Sunday morning, his body's gone.
And how would you?
Yeah, now where is it? And there was also a tradition that on day 4, which would then be Monday, on day 4, the face has so changed you cannot recognize the corpse. So I imagine they're thinking, if we don't find Jesus today, we will never find him. That's what they're thinking.
Was it unusual for Jesus, because he died a criminal's death, to be buried in a tomb by someone like Joseph of Arimathea?
Well, see, that's the interesting thing about it. Jesus was not condemned by every member of the Sanhedrin. There were some exceptions. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were 2 of them. And so I think what Joseph is doing is it's a little bit of a protest. So he's saying, okay, he can't be buried in a place of honor, so he puts him in a neutral spot.
Right.
Even a criminal's tomb is brand new at one point. And so he puts his body into a tomb he personally owns. Which I think that was extremely huge and generous on his part, because that contaminates it. That would be the idea, see. That's now a criminal's tomb. It never will be an honorable place.
So it's Good Friday, but Sunday's coming, and we're getting ready to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. Tell us, because we won't be here Easter Sunday morning, a little bit about why you believe Jesus is who he says he is and why he rose from the dead. In your mind, as an academic, why are you convinced that this is the most plausible explanation of what happened and that Jesus is who he said he is?
I'm convinced that Jesus was raised from the dead because it's the only explanation of all of the evidence. I mean, you can speculate if you want, you can indulge in special pleading, you can reject evidence if you want, but that's not academic, that's not a scholarly thing. If you take seriously the evidence and the logic behind it all, I find the resurrection inescapable. And for one thing, it turned the disciples around. They did not expect, a future resurrection someday in the distant future maybe, but a resurrection on the third day?
Yeah.
They didn't expect that. They were discouraged, they were defeated. There had been other charismatic leaders before, and when they were killed, they stayed dead. So maybe we got it wrong. Maybe Jesus wasn't what we thought. And so they weren't expecting it. And don't forget, they're Jews, they're monotheists, they believe in God, they have the law of Moses, they have hope. Why would they embrace something that's a fiction? They would just go on with their lives. That to me is very, very convincing. And then the conversion of Saul of Tarsus and turning him into the Apostle Paul. For me, that's icing on the cake. The resurrection is the only explanation that makes sense of all the evidence.
It's amazing to me that not only does the heart lead to Jesus, but the mind also leads there when you look at all the evidence. You've helped us tremendously this week, Dr. Evans. Thank you so, so much. And hey, if you're wondering, who is Jesus and maybe you're not fully convinced, there are people who would love to pray with you and love to talk with you. Our prayer lines are open right now. You can call 1-866-273-4444. In fact, whenever you're watching this, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, call those lines. Somebody will be there live for you. And we'll be back this Good Friday with some final thoughts.